6 days. That's how long before I even told my son I was getting married. He had already filed papers in court to take control of my house, my savings, and my entire life. He sat at my dinner table that night, smiling, eating my stew, while a lawsuit against me was already sitting in a courthouse file. And when the doorbell rang later that evening, I had no idea it was about to change everything I thought I knew about my own son. I'm Michael Carter, 62 years old. I raised my son Ryan alone for 21 years after my wife Mary passed away. I worked nights, weekends, holidays, whatever it took. I skipped vacations so he'd graduate college debt-free. I refinanced my own house to keep him afloat. For 2 decades, I believe that's what a good father did. I never imagined all that sacrifice would one day be used against me in a courtroom. It started on an ordinary Tuesday in Noblesville, Indiana. Gray sky, wet leaves on the driveway, my knee aching the way it always does before winter. I spent the afternoon making beef stew in the old blue Dutch oven that used to belong to my wife. Ryan loved that stew as a kid, always picking out the carrots and lining them up along the rim of his bowl. Even now at 38, he still asked for seconds. I wanted to tell him something that night, father to son, before anyone else heard it. I was getting married. Her name was Susan, and she made me feel like my life wasn't over. At 6:10, Ryan's SUV pulled into the driveway. His wife Ashley was with him, scrolling through her phone before she even stepped out of the car. Ryan handed me a bottle of bourbon at the door, joking it was an early Christmas present, always his way of cutting tension before it started. Ashley kissed my cheek and set her handbag on the dining chair that used to be Mary's. I noticed it, felt foolish for noticing, and moved it the moment she left the room. Dinner started easy enough. Small talk, traffic, my grandson's school play. Then I put down my spoon and told them I'd asked Susan to marry me. She said yes. The room went quiet, just quiet enough that I could hear my own refrigerator humming. Ryan reached across the table and shook my hand like we'd closed a business deal. Ashley asked when it happened. Then Ryan asked the only question that mattered to him. Have you two talked about a prenup? Not congratulations. Not are you happy. A prenup. Ashley folded her napkin carefully and said second marriages can get complicated, especially with property, retirement accounts, beneficiaries. Ryan added, what Ashley means is, we just want you protected. Protected from what? I asked. From Susan? Her face softened, the way you'd talk to a child. No one thinks Susan is bad, she said, but people change when money is involved. Then Ryan said something that cut deeper than he probably meant it to. Dad, you worked your whole life for what you have. Mom worked for it too. My wife spent 14 years at a dental office before she got sick. And after she died, I worked every shift I could get just to keep this family standing. I didn't need my own son reminding me who built this life. That's when Ashley reached beside her chair and pulled out a folder. Navy blue, official. They'd spoken to someone about setting up a family trust. Just as a precaution, she said. Ryan slid the papers toward me. Draft instructions. Trustee, Ryan Carter. Property to be transferred. My house, my brokerage accounts, my investments. Monthly distributions decided by the trustee. You want to be in charge of my own money, he said. That's not how I'd put it. I said, it's written right here in black and white. You can still marry Susan. Ashley said gently, nobody's stopping you. Just move everything into the trust first. And you'll still have access. I asked if they'd already decided how long I had left to live. That's not fair, Ryan said. No, I told him. This feels less like protecting me and more like dividing up my life while I'm still sitting right here at my own table. That's when the doorbell rang. A man in a dark jacket stood on my porch, holding a large envelope. Michael Carter? He asked. I said yes. He told me he was serving me legal documents from Hamilton County Superior Court. My stomach dropped straight to the floor. I carried it back to the table. Ryan had gone pale. Ashley's hands were folded tight in her lap, like she already knew what was coming. I opened the first page. A petition for guardianship. Over my person, over my estate, my name listed as the alleged incapacitated adult. My son's name listed right below as the one asking to take control. I checked the filing date. 6 days earlier. 6 days before I even sat down to tell them about the wedding. My own son had gone to a judge to strip me of my rights before he'd even pretended to be happy for me. "We were hoping you'd cooperate," he said. "That folder on the table wasn't a request. That dinner wasn't a conversation. It was their last attempt to get me to sign my life away quietly before they forced it through a courtroom." I asked why he'd filed this before I ever told him a wedding date, and he gave me the answer that told me everything I needed to know. "We knew you wouldn't listen." That was the moment I understood. They hadn't come to protect me from Susan. They'd come to protect my money from me. I didn't sleep that night. At 1:30 in the morning, cold coffee in hand, I read every page of that petition. It never once called me a bad father. It was worse. It described me as a man whose judgment could no longer be trusted. One line claimed I'd forgotten where I parked my truck at my grandson's baseball game. True, except it left out that I'd parked 2 blocks away because the lot was full. Another mentioned a missed dental appointment because I'd written down the wrong day. A whole section covered a $2,100 necklace I bought Susan, called an unusually extravagant purchase, inconsistent with my prior habits. Funny, nobody questioned my judgment when I spent more than that fixing Ryan's transmission 3 years earlier. The page that finally stopped me cold was about my doctor's visit. I'd mentioned some forgetfulness during a routine physical and trouble sleeping after a medication change. My doctor adjusted the dosage. That was it. No diagnosis, no dementia, no Alzheimer's. Just an ordinary conversation, twisted into the opening chapter of a story about a man losing his mind. At 8 the next morning, I called Robert Hughes, a lawyer I'd trusted for nearly 30 years. The moment I told him my son had filed for guardianship, the line went silent. Then he simply said, "Come to my office." Robert read every page without interrupting, then gave it to me straight. "They're asking a judge to decide whether you're still capable of running your own life. Can they actually do that?" I asked. "They can ask," he said. "Asking isn't winning." Then he gave me 3 rules. Don't move money out of anger. Don't send emotional texts. And whatever happens, don't argue with Ryan, because anything you say could become evidence against you. That evening, Susan showed up with homemade soup because she knew I hadn't eaten. Reading the petition, tears filled her eyes at the part accusing her of manipulating me. "Maybe we should postpone the wedding," she said. "A year, maybe longer." "What about 2 years?" I asked. 5. She had no answer because there wasn't one. This was never about timing. It was about control. That night, my phone rang again. Robert told me they'd requested an emergency hearing, asking for temporary authority over my finances before the case was even reviewed. Standing alone on my porch, I realized something that scared me more than getting older ever had. I wasn't afraid of aging. I was afraid the people I loved most had already decided I didn't get a say anymore in how I lived the years I had left. The following week, I sat through a court-ordered mental evaluation. "What year is it? Who's the governor? What medications do you take?" I answered every question without hesitation. Then came the ones that felt less like medicine and more like a test of whether I still deserved to be treated like an adult. If someone offered to buy your house for half its value tomorrow, what would you do? "I'd ask them to leave," I said. 2 hours later, I sat in my truck in that parking lot for 5 straight minutes before I could turn the key. It wasn't the exam that shook me. It was realizing how easily ordinary moments, forgetting your keys, missing an appointment, buying someone you love a gift, could be stitched together into a story about a man losing control of his mind. A few days later, Robert sat me down with a stack of legal pads. "Forget their story," he said. "Let's build yours." We listed every time I'd financially helped my son. The down payment on his first house, a business loan when his company struggled, 6 months of his mortgage after that business collapsed, preschool tuition, hospital bills after his second child was born. The list kept growing all afternoon. By the end, Robert added it up. $468,230. I honestly hadn't realized it was that much. Robert said something that stayed with me for weeks. Somewhere along the way, he stopped feeling like your son and started acting like your client. That evening, Susan brought her own folder, documents nobody had asked her for. retirement statements, proof she owned her townhouse outright, paid off 4 years earlier, 36 years of pension from the school district, a signed prenuptial agreement waiving any claim to my property. "This doesn't prove she isn't influencing you," Robert said. "But it proves something almost as important. She doesn't need your money." A few days later, Ryan asked me to meet him, Ashley, and their lawyer to work something out. I almost said no. Instead, I went. Their lawyer slid over a revised proposal. I could stay in my own house and receive a monthly allowance based on a spreadsheet they'd already built, breaking down my groceries, my utilities, even my dining out habits. They had budgeted my entire life without asking me a single question. Then I saw one line at the bottom. Potential sale value. Noblesville residence. "Have you already discussed selling my house?" I asked. Ashley answered too fast. "No." "Then why is there already an estimated price on the page?" I asked. She had no real answer. Walking to the parking lot, Robert told me Ashley had just made a critical mistake. She'd admitted, without meaning to, that they were already planning for life after I lost control of my property. Judges notice timing like that. The next morning, Robert called again. They'd filed an amended petition, this time asking the court to freeze my major financial transactions before the wedding, claiming I was likely to move my assets. That's when I understood fully that this had never been about my health. It was about making sure I couldn't touch my own money without their permission. The hearing was set for 9 o'clock on a Thursday at the Hamilton County Judicial Center. I arrived 45 minutes early, the way 38 years at UPS had trained me to. Robert waited on a bench outside the courtroom with terrible coffee for both of us, and for one small moment, we smiled because it reminded me I was still allowed to feel like a normal person. Susan arrived in a simple navy dress and slipped her cold hand into mine without a word. Across the hallway, Ryan and Ashley walked in with their lawyer. Ryan barely looked at me. Inside, their attorney spoke first, calm and careful, insisting no one thought I was a bad man, that the petition only existed to protect me during a major life change. He listed the necklace, the missed appointment, the forgotten keys, the medication change, laying each one out like a pattern. Alone, each meant nothing. Together, they wanted it to sound like the beginning of the end for me. Then, Robert stood, walked to the podium, and said one sentence I'll never forget. "Growing older does not make someone incapable. It makes someone older." He submitted my independent evaluation. The judge read it in silence, then called me to the stand. "Who manages your money?" she asked. "I do." Had Susan ever asked to manage it? Never. Their lawyer asked why I'd suddenly started buying more expensive gifts. "Because I'm 62, I said, "and I finally met someone worth celebrating." The room went quiet. Then he asked if I admitted to having memory problems. "No," I said, looking him dead in the eye. "I admit I'm getting older. If forgetting where you parked your truck one afternoon means you lose the right to run your own life, half the people at the grocery store should be standing up here beside me." A few quiet laughs spread through the courtroom. Even the judge almost smiled. Robert asked Ryan directly, under oath, whether I had voluntarily given him nearly $500,000 over the years. Yes. Whether he'd promised to repay most of it. Yes. Whether he ever had. No. Then the judge asked her own question, the one that changed everything. "When did you first ask your father to transfer his property into a trust under your control?" "A few days before that dinner." "And when was this petition filed?" 6 days before that dinner. The courtroom went still. "So," she said, "before you even spoke to your father, you'd already asked this court to strip him of control over his own life." Ryan had no answer. "Had any doctor diagnosed me with dementia?" "No." "Alzheimer's?" "No." "Any condition preventing me from understanding my own finances?" "No." "Then what exactly changed?" she asked. Ryan opened his mouth and nothing came out. A local realtor testified that Ashley had contacted her weeks earlier, asking for an estimated sale value of my house, before I'd ever said a word about selling it. The judge asked Ashley why she'd started pricing my home before I made that decision. She had no answer. The silence answered for her. The judge recessed for 20 minutes, the longest 20 minutes of my life. When she returned, she spoke plainly. The court finds insufficient evidence that Michael Carter lacks the capacity to manage his own affairs. The request for guardianship is denied. The petition is dismissed. I closed my eyes, not because I'd won, but because for the first time in weeks, I could finally breathe. Outside, Ryan caught up to me. "Dad, we were scared," he said. "You were scared I might spend my own money," I told him quietly. "You never once wondered if by treating me like I couldn't be trusted, you were losing your father." "Not today," I said, and walked out with Susan on my arm into the cold November air, lighter than I'd felt in weeks. We postponed our wedding 6 weeks, not from doubt, but because I needed time to remember my life still belonged to me. Every ring of the phone made my stomach tighten, expecting another legal notice. Susan never pushed. Some evenings we just walked the trail at the park is séance. And that silence finally felt earned instead of heavy. We married on a quiet December afternoon in a small church in Carmel. About 30 guests, roast chicken, mashed potatoes, simple white cake, an old playlist through church speakers. Halfway through dinner, Susan whispered that this was exactly the wedding she'd hoped for. Ryan wasn't there. I thought about him more than once that day, reaching for my phone, then putting it away. Love doesn't disappear because someone hurts you, but forgiveness doesn't run on anyone else's schedule. The following week, I sat with Robert one final time to rebuild my estate plan, this time out of clarity, not anger. He asked me a question that changed everything. Not who gets what, but what do you want your money to accomplish? I told him I wanted Susan protected for life in that house if I went first. I wanted my grandchildren to have real opportunities, but I never wanted money to become another excuse for someone to stop taking responsibility for their own life. Ryan would never manage a cent of it. Whatever was left after Susan would go into a trust tied to real things: education, medical care, a first home someday, never a blank check. Changing the will was easy. Changing 21 years of old habits was the hardest part. 6 weeks later, Ryan called about his transmission going out, needing help. For 2 decades, I knew exactly how that conversation went. He'd ask, I'd pay. This time I asked if he'd gotten an estimate, told him that was rough, and said I couldn't give him the money. I offered to drive him to work, offered to help him compare shops, but I would not write that check. It felt terrible, and somehow it also felt exactly right. Almost 4 months after the hearing, Ryan showed up in my backyard with his own toolbox while I was fixing a broken fence. No invitation needed. We worked side by side for 3 hours, talking about nothing important and everything important at once. He told me he'd started seeing a counselor who'd asked him a question he said he'd remember for the rest of his life. "Why do you keep calling your father's money our future?" He'd convinced himself he was protecting his mother's legacy. "Your mother never called it her money," I told him gently. "She called it ours. After she was gone, it just became the life I kept building for both of us." His eyes filled up, and this time there were no excuses, just 2 words: "I'm sorry." Did that erase everything? No, trust doesn't grow back overnight. But for the first time in months, I saw my son standing in front of me again, instead of the stranger who'd sat across from me with a folder full of paperwork. I asked if he was hungry. I still had leftover beef stew. We didn't talk about court or money or guardianship that afternoon. Some wounds heal one quiet Saturday at a time. Looking back, I don't think the real lesson here was ever about money. It was about boundaries. For years, I believed loving my son meant rescuing him from every hard moment. What I finally learned at 62 is that real love sometimes means stepping back, telling the truth, and letting another grown adult carry the weight of his own choices. Susan says our marriage didn't really begin on our wedding day. It began the day I stopped apologizing for wanting a life of my own. If you've ever struggled to protect your own peace while still loving someone who hurt you, I hope this reminds you that you're not alone, and that setting a boundary isn't cruelty. Sometimes, it's the kindest thing you can do for everyone involved, even when it doesn't feel that way at first. If this story hit home for you, hit subscribe to Aftermath Tales, because these are the stories nobody talks about until it's too late. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And if you know someone going through something like this right now, send them this video. It might be exactly what they need to hear today.